So we're going to close today the eighth chapter of Sotah, which is the chapter of the laws of war. And we learned so far that many people don't have to serve. Some people, someone who's betrothed a woman but hasn't yet married her, will go out in battle but then return home before battle begins. And some people won't even go out to battle. And some people who are afraid will go back. And then at the end of that whole process, but at the end of that whole process, there's no more turning back. And there's a final speech that, or right at the end of the speech, that the officers make to the people, and that when they've made that speech, they stop anyone turning back. And the Mishnah is going to begin with a verse from Devarim, from the same description in Sefer Devarim that we've been reading already. V'haya kechalot hashotrim l'daber el ha'am. So when they finish speaking to the people, when they finish giving people who are afraid time to go home, people who don't need to be in the army time to go home, when they finish all that, ufaktu sarei tzvot b'rosh ha'am. At that point, they appoint captains of hosts, it's translated, captains of bands at the head of the people. And the Mishnah then adds, Uva akevo shalam, and at the rear of the people, Ma'amidin zekifin lifnehem, they station guards in front of them. Ve'acharim me'acharehem, and others behind them. So these are the non-commissioned officers. They're stationed in front and behind the people. Ve'chashilim shel bazel bidehem, and they have iron axes in their hands. Ve'chol hamavakesh lachzor harashut biyado lekapeach et shokav. And if anybody then wishes to flee, they've got permission to strike his thighs. So at this point, they can physically stop anyone from fleeing. Shetchilat nisan nefilah, because the beginning of running away means just falling. Shen Emar, we have a verse from Shmuel Aleph. Nas Yisrael lifnei Plishtim, Israel ran away from the Philistines. V'gam megefa gdola hayta b'hem, and the people also suffered a great blow. Ulhalan hu omer, and a different verse from Shmuel Aleph. This is now describing, by the way, the death of Jonathan and Saul on Mount Gilboa. Ulhalan hu omer, and elsewhere, further on, it says, "Vayanusu anshe Yisrael mipnei Plishtim." The people of Israel fell before the Philistines. Vayiplu chalalim bahar haGilboa, and the slain fell on the mountain of the Gilboa. So it seems as if the guards have got the right to do physical damage to a soldier who wants to run away. And it's very interesting that Maimonides is clearly disturbed by this, because he comments um, uh, in Hilchot. Oh, I've just lost the source here. In Hilchot, Hilchot Melachim u'Milchemet, Hilchot Melachim u'Milchamot, that someone who's afraid in war is transgressing a negative mitzvah, because he's essentially making everybody else afraid. He's making everyone, and he concludes these halachot right at the end of the seventh chapter of Hilchot Melachim u'Milchamot. He concludes by saying that someone who goes out to war, if you like, should go out in full confidence, because God will protect him if he's in the right frame of mind. And then the Mishnah goes on. So in other words, the Mishnah has clarified that at this point, there's no turning back. The people who are in the army have to stay in the army. And then it goes on. This is the last Mishnah of the eighth chapter. Then it goes on to say that these exceptions that we've seen so far, they don't apply. They don't apply to all wars. B'mei dvarim amurim. To what does this apply? I.e., to what does the ability not to serve apply? B'mei dvarim amurim. To what does this apply? B'milchemet harushut. To a voluntary war. What's a voluntary war? Well, let's turn for a second to the Rambam again. Ein hamelech nilcham tchila ela milchemet mitzvah. A king should initially only wage war as a milchemet mitzvah, as a war of mitzvah, a war of command. Ve'ezehi milchemet mitzvah, what is a war of command? Well, he explains it's the war against the seven nations who occupied Eretz Yisrael, the war against Amalek. I mean, these don't apply nowadays because the Talmud says that Sennacherib mixed up all the nations after he invaded the land of Israel. This is in the year 745, before the Common Era. The king Sennacherib essentially used to pick up nations from one part of his empire and put them down somewhere else, and vice versa, to encourage ethnic blending. So the Talmud says that after that point, we don't really know which nation anybody comes from. So these mitzvot, the war against the seven nations or against Amalek, this doesn't apply anymore because we don't know who's an Amalekite. And I guess perhaps more subtly, that the Talmud there is saying that we don't treat people according to national stereotypes anymore. So these wars don't apply. But the Rambam goes on to say another kind of milchemet mitzvah, of war of mitzvah, ve'ezrat Yisrael miyatzar sheba alehem, and a war fought to assist Israel from an enemy which attacks them. In other words, a defensive war is a milchemet mitzvah. It's a war of mitzvah. And then he goes on to say, look, afterwards, the king can wage a milchemet rushut. He can maybe go to war to enlarge the border of Israel, but first he has to take care of milchemet mitzvah. So let's come back to our Mishnah now. Bamei dvarim armorim. To what do these exemptions apply? B'milchemet harushut, to a voluntary war. Aval b'milchemet mitzvah hakol yotze. In a milchemet mitzvah, in an obligatory war, so for example, a war to defend Israel from its enemies, hakol yotze, all go out. Afilu chatan mechedro ve'chala mechupata. Even a bridegroom from his chamber and a bride from her canopy. Really, really interesting, because the halacha here, as quoted by the halacha here, as quoted in the Mishnah, is gender neutral. Completely gender neutral, none of the gender distinctions that we have today in terms of draft. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to have a slightly different take on this. The Rambam makes clear the halakha doesn't go according to Rabbi Yehuda. But let's read Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Bamei dvarim amorim. Why are these? In what context are these things said? B'milchemet mitzvah. In a milchemet mitzvah. Apparently, in a milchemet mitzvah there are get outs. Aval b'milchemet chova, in an obligatory war. We don't really know what Rabbi Yehuda means by an obligatory war, but we suspect it's very similar actually to the Rambam's definition of milchemet mitzvah, a mitzvah war. Aval b'milchemet chova, in an obligatory war, hakol yotze, everybody has to go. Afilu chatan mechedro ve'chala mechupata, even the bridegroom from his chamber and a bride from her canopy. There are certain types of situation in which everyone has to go, regardless of their gender, regardless of their status.